Some say karma moves slowly, but on that fateful night at St. Andrew's Memorial Hospital, it struck with the force of a lightning bolt. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously in the labor and delivery ward as Sarah Chen, head nurse of 15 years, made what would become the biggest mistake of her career. She didn't know it yet, but her next words would trigger a chain of events that would expose decades of systemic racism within the hospital's walls and bring one of the most powerful healthcare institutions in Boston to its knees. "Oh, honey, you're being dramatic," Nurse Chen sneered, not even bothering to look up from her phone as Amara Richardson writhed in agony on the hospital bed. "I've seen hundreds of deliveries, and trust me, you're barely even started. Some women can actually handle pain without making such a fuss." The words hung in the air like poison, mixing with the steady beep of the fetal monitor and Amara's labored breathing. What Nurse Chen didn't notice was the subtle change in posture of the distinguished-looking man standing in the corner of the room. Dr. Marcus Richardson, Chief of Cardiology at Massachusetts General Hospital and the incoming CEO of the entire St. Andrew's Healthcare Network. The man who had specifically chosen to keep his connection to this hospital quiet until the official announcement next week. The man whose wife was now being dismissed and degraded during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. But let me take you back 12 hours earlier, when this day of reckoning truly began. Earlier that morning, 7:45 a.m., Amara Richardson stood before the full-length mirror in their Beacon Hill brownstone, smoothing her hands over her swollen belly. At 8 months pregnant, she had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and subtle shifts in treatment she received. The sales associates who followed her too closely in high-end stores, the taxi drivers who mysteriously had just gone off duty when they saw her hailing a cab, the restaurant hosts who claimed to have lost her reservations despite her husband's name being on the list. But today was different. Today she and Marcus would finally tour the hospital where their daughter would be born. As one of Boston's top cardiac surgeons, Marcus had been headhunted for months by St. Andrew's Memorial, and after careful consideration, he had accepted their offer to become CEO of their entire healthcare network. They had kept his appointment quiet, his idea actually, so he could observe the hospital's true culture before taking the reins. "Ready, love." Marcus appeared in the doorway, his tie perfectly knotted, dark skin gleaming in the morning light. After 15 years of marriage, he still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "As ready as I'll ever be," Amara smiled, reaching for her designer handbag, a subtle armor she wore in spaces where her presence was often questioned. She had learned early in her career as a civil rights attorney that appearance mattered, especially for a black woman in predominantly white spaces. Her Hermes bag and carefully tailored maternity dress were more than fashion choices. They were shields against the assumptions people made about who she was and what she deserved. They were halfway to the hospital when the first contraction hit. "Marcus!" Amara gasped, clutching the dashboard. "Something's wrong. This doesn't feel like the Braxton Hicks." Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "We're only 10 minutes away. Hold on, baby." By the time they pulled into the emergency entrance, Amara's contractions were coming every 7 minutes. This wasn't part of the plan. Their daughter wasn't due for another 4 weeks. The tour forgotten, Marcus helped Amara through the entrance, where they were immediately met by a young nurse who took one look at them and said, "Regular registration is around the corner." "My wife is in labor," Marcus stated firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding operating rooms. "She needs immediate attention." The nurse's expression shifted slightly. That familiar micro-adjustment Amar had seen countless times when people realized they might have made an incorrect assumption. They were quickly ushered to labor and delivery, where they met Nurse Sarah Chen. From the moment she entered the room, Nurse Chen's dismissiveness was palpable. She took her time checking Amara's vitals, sighing dramatically when Amara cried out during a particularly intense contraction. "First baby?" she asked, her tone condescending. When Amara nodded through gritted teeth, Nurse Chen rolled her eyes. "Well, if you're this worked up already, you're in for a long day. You're only 2 centimeters dilated." Marcus stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "My wife is in considerable pain. We'd like to discuss pain management options." Nurse Chen barely glanced at him. The doctor will discuss that during rounds. If we gave epidurals to everyone who thought they couldn't handle early labor, we'd never get anything done around here. As if to punctuate her words, Amara was hit with another contraction. This one so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Through the haze of pain, she heard the nurse's dismissive comment about some people having a different pain tolerance and saw her husband's expression darken. What happened next would become hospital legend, the moment when karma, justice, and long overdue change collided in one perfect storm. But first, let me tell you about the letter sitting in Marcus Richardson's pocket, the one announcing his appointment as CEO, the one he had planned to share during their hospital tour, the one that was about to turn Nurse Chen's world upside down. The tension in room 407 was building like a thundercloud. Outside, Boston's summer sun beat down on the hospital's windows, but inside a storm was brewing. Nurse Chen had no idea she was about to become the catalyst for the biggest discrimination lawsuit St. Andrew's Memorial had ever faced. She couldn't have known that her patient's husband had spent the last 6 months secretly evaluating the hospital's culture, or that every dismissive word she spoke was being mentally documented by not one, but 2 legal powerhouses. As Amara's contractions intensified, so did the nurse's condescension. Each dismissal, each rolling of eyes, each delayed response to the call button was another nail in the coffin of her career. But the real turning point came when Dr. Lisa Warren, the attending physician, finally arrived for rounds. And that's when everything changed. Dr. Lisa Warren swept into room 407 with the distracted air of someone already running late. Her eyes were glued to her tablet as she spoke, not even looking up at her patient. "Nurse Chen, what do we have here?" "First-time mother, making a lot of noise but only 2 centimeters dilated," Nurse Chen reported with practiced efficiency, though her tone carried an unmistakable note of dismissal. "Probably another case of early labor anxiety." Dr. Warren nodded absently, still not having made eye contact with either Amara or Marcus. "Well, Mrs." She finally glanced up and her voice trailed off as she took in the scene before her. Amara, clearly in severe distress, and Marcus, whose commanding presence seemed to fill the room. "Richardson," Marcus supplied coolly, "my wife has been experiencing intense contractions every 4 minutes for the past hour, and we've received nothing but dismissal and condescension from your staff." Something in his tone made Dr. Warren pause. She looked more closely at Marcus, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. Though they had never met, his reputation preceded him. Dr. Marcus Richardson was something of a legend in Boston medical circles. The brilliant cardiac surgeon who had revolutionized minimally invasive procedures at Mass General. "Dr. Richardson," she said, her demeanor shifting dramatically. I wasn't aware you were—" "Clearly," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years in operating rooms, where his commands meant the difference between life and death. "Now, would someone like to explain why my wife has been denied pain management options despite her clear distress?" Before Dr. Warren could respond, Amara let out a cry that made everyone in the room flinch. Everyone except Nurse Chen, who muttered under her breath, "Some people just don't have any pain tolerance." The room went deadly quiet. Marcus pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, the letter he'd been saving for the hospital tour, the one announcing his appointment as CEO. Without a word, he handed it to Dr. Warren. The color drained from her face as she read it. "Nurse Chen," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "please page anesthesiology immediately for an epidural consult." "But she's only—" Nurse Chen began to protest. "Now!" Dr. Warren's voice cracked like a whip. As Nurse Chen grudgingly reached for the phone, Amara grabbed Marcus's hand with crushing force. "Marcus," she gasped, "something's really wrong. This isn't normal." For the first time since they'd arrived, real concern flickered across Dr. Warren's face. She quickly examined Amara, and her professional mask slipped. "She's bleeding. Get me an ultrasound, stat." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The ultrasound revealed what everyone had feared: a partial placental abruption. Amara needed an emergency C-section. "Prep or 2, Dr. Warren commanded, but Nurse Chen hesitated. "Or 2 is reserved for Dr. Matthew's elective cases," she said. "He won't I don't give a damn what Dr. Matthews likes. Marcus's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. My wife is having an emergency C-section in operating room 2, and if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with the new CEO. The look on Nurse Chen's face was almost worth the hours of dismissal and degradation. Almost. But there wasn't time to savor it. As they rushed Amara toward the operating room, Marcus pulled out his phone and made 2 calls, one to his lawyer and one to the hospital board chairman. In the operating room, Dr. Warren proved herself to be a skilled surgeon when not distracted by prejudices and assumptions. The C-section went smoothly, and within minutes, the sound of a baby's first cry filled the room. Their daughter, Zara, was small but healthy, her lungs clearly working perfectly as she announced her arrival to the world. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As Amara recovered in the post-op ward, Marcus sat in the hospital's administrative offices. The board chairman and the hospital's legal team assembled before him. The letter of appointment lay on the table between them, but now it was accompanied by something else. A thick folder containing documented instances of racial bias in patient care at St. Andrew's Memorial, collected over the 6 months Marcus had been considering the CEO position. Gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice carrying the same authority that had commanded OR teams for years. We need to discuss the systemic changes that will be implemented at this hospital, effective immediately. The board chairman cleared his throat nervously. Dr. Richardson, perhaps we could handle this internally, like you've been handling it for the past several decades? Marcus's voice was sharp enough to cut Diamond. My wife, a successful attorney who specialized in civil rights law before opening her own practice, just experienced firsthand the kind of discrimination that's been normalized in your institution. The only difference is she's in a position to do something about it. He opened the folder, revealing page after page of documented incidents, statistics, and patient complaints that had been buried or dismissed. This isn't just about what happened today. This is about every patient who's ever been dismissed, every pain that's been minimized, every concern that's been ignored because of the color of someone's skin. But even as Marcus laid out his plans for sweeping reforms, Nurse Chen was making a decision that would turn this situation from a private institutional reckoning into a public scandal that would rock the entire Boston medical community. Sarah Chen had worked at St. Andrew's Memorial for 15 years, and she wasn't about to let her career be destroyed by what she viewed as an overreaction. In the staff break room, her fingers flew across her phone's keyboard as she typed out a lengthy post on a private Facebook group for Boston area nurses. Can't believe these people playing the race card just because they didn't get special treatment fast enough. Now suddenly he's supposed to be our new CEO? Well, I have videos. What Nurse Chen didn't realize was that during her years of discriminatory behavior, she had developed a habit of recording difficult patients to protect herself from complaints. Today, her phone had captured every dismissive comment, every eye roll, every delayed response to Amara's calls for help. She thought these videos would support her side of the story. She was catastrophically wrong. Within hours, her post had been screenshot and shared beyond the private group. By midnight, hashtag Justice for Amara was trending on Twitter, accompanied by clips from Chen's own recordings that had been shared by outraged members of the medical community. The videos didn't show what she thought they showed. Instead of documenting a difficult patient, they captured clear evidence of medical racism in action. But the most damaging clip wasn't of Amara at all. It was a video from 3 months ago, when Chen was caught on her own recording saying to another nurse, "These people always come in claiming they're in pain, like they're the only ones who've ever had a baby. I've learned to just let them wait it out." The storm hit the morning news cycle with devastating force. Marcus was in Amara's recovery room, cradling little Zara, when his phone started buzzing incessantly. The story had gone viral. National news networks were picking it up. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. The hospital's phone lines were flooded with calls from angry citizens and concerned patients. "Marcus," Amara said softly, watching her husband's face as he scrolled through the headlines. "This is bigger than us now." He looked up at his wife, saw the determination in her eyes despite her exhaustion, and nodded. "I know, love. That's exactly why we can't let it go." In the administrative wing, the hospital board was in crisis mode. They had hoped to handle this quietly, to implement changes gradually under Marcus's leadership. Instead, they were facing a public relations nightmare. The chairman's phone rang. It was the mayor's office, then the governor's, then the American Medical Association. Meanwhile, other stories were pouring in. Chen's videos had broken a dam of silence. Current and former patients began sharing their own experiences of discrimination at St. Andrew's Memorial. A pattern emerged: delayed care, dismissed concerns, unnecessary suffering, particularly among patients of color. Dr. Warren, to her credit, made a decision that would ultimately save her career. She walked into the board meeting unannounced and laid out her own documented concerns about systemic bias in the hospital's practices. Concerns she had raised before, but had been told to handle internally. "I was part of the problem," she admitted, her voice steady. "I let fear of rocking the boat prevent me from pushing harder for change. But today I watched a mother nearly lose her life because we've normalized discrimination in our practices. I won't be silent anymore." By afternoon, protesters had gathered outside the hospital. News vans lined the street. Social media was ablaze with hashtags: Hasha St. Andrew's shame, Arshin medical racism, Unashin end healthcare discrimination. But inside room 407, something remarkable was happening. A steady stream of nurses, doctors, and hospital staff, mostly people of color, came to pay their respects to the Richardsons. Each one had a story. Each one had witnessed or experienced what Amara had endured, and each one was ready to stand up and say, "Enough." Sarah Chen, meanwhile, had barricaded herself in the nurses' station, refusing to leave as security waited outside. She was live streaming her side of the story, digging herself deeper with every word. "I've worked here 15 years, she declared to her dwindling supporters. "I know what I'm talking about. They're trying to destroy my career because I wouldn't bow down to—" The stream cut off abruptly as hospital security finally intervened. But the most powerful moment of that day came when Amara, still recovering from surgery, asked Marcus to help her sit up in bed. With their newborn daughter sleeping peacefully beside her, she opened her laptop and began to write. To every mother who wasn't believed, to every patient whose pain was dismissed, to every person who was made to feel less worthy of care because of the color of their skin, this is for you. Her open letter would become the cornerstone of what happened next. A reckoning that would reshape not just St. Andrew's Memorial, but healthcare institutions across the country. Because what Sarah Chen and the hospital board hadn't realized was that they had picked the wrong family to discriminate against. They had handed a weapon to precisely the people who knew how to use it for systemic change. And as night fell over Boston, as little Zara slept safely in her mother's arms, as Marcus finalized the most important policy document of his career, and as Amara's letter began its journey across the internet, no one in room 407 knew that tomorrow would bring an even bigger surprise, one that would ensure St. Andrew's Memorial would never be the same again. Dawn broke over Boston, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but St. Andrew's Memorial had never truly slept. Throughout the night, Amara's letter had spread like wildfire, shared hundreds of thousands of times across social media platforms. Justice for Amara had evolved into Shashin Change Healthcare Now, and the movement was growing by the minute. But the real earthquake was yet to come. At 9 a.m. sharp, Marcus Richardson stood before a hastily assembled press conference in the hospital's main auditorium. Camera lights flashed as he approached the podium, Amara beside him in a wheelchair, little Zara sleeping peacefully in her arms. The room fell silent as Marcus began to speak. "Yesterday, my wife nearly lost her life due to systemic racism in healthcare. Today, we're not just here to talk about change, we're here to implement it." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out not one document, but three. "First," so he announced, "I hold in my hand my acceptance of the CEO position at St. Andrew's Memorial, effective immediately. Not next week, not after a transition period, but right now." The reporter's cameras clicked frantically. "Second, I have here a detailed reform plan, developed over the past 6 months as I evaluated this hospital's culture. This plan includes mandatory bias training, new accountability measures, and the establishment of an independent patient advocacy board with real power to investigate complaints. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. But the third document is the most important. My wife, Amara Richardson, is not just a mother who survived medical racism. She is one of Boston's most respected civil rights attorneys, and in collaboration with a coalition of medical professionals of color, she has drafted legislation that will require all Massachusetts hospitals to implement similar reforms. The room erupted. Amara, still pale but sitting straight in her wheelchair, lifted her chin with quiet dignity as reporters shouted questions. But they weren't done. Furthermore, Marcus continued, raising his voice above the chaos, we are announcing the establishment of the Richardson Initiative for Healthcare Equity. Funded with $50 million of our own money, this initiative will support medical students of color, fund research into healthcare disparities, and provide legal assistance to victims of medical discrimination. In the back of the room, Dr. Warren stood quietly, tears streaming down her face. Beside her were dozens of hospital staff members, nurses, doctors, technicians, and support staff, many of whom had come forward overnight with their own stories of witnessed discrimination. The press conference wasn't even over when the hospital board chairman received a call from the governor's office expressing support for the proposed legislation. Major healthcare networks across the state were already reaching out, wanting to get ahead of the curve by voluntarily implementing similar reforms. Sarah Chen watched it all unfold on the small TV in her lawyer's office, her face ashen. Her medical license was under review, and 3 different civil rights organizations had filed complaints against her. But perhaps most devastating was the announcement that her own recordings would be used in future training sessions as examples of how implicit bias in overt racism manifest in medical care. But this story isn't really about Sarah Chen's downfall. It's about what rose from the ashes of her actions. 1 month later, Amara stood before the Massachusetts state legislature, baby Zara strapped to her chest, and delivered a testimony that would be remembered for years to come. My daughter was born into a broken system, she said, her voice clear and strong. But she will grow up in one that we fixed, because that's what you do when something is broken. You don't just point out the cracks, you repair them, you rebuild, you make it better than it was before. The Richardson Initiative became a national model. Within a year, similar programs had been established in 27 states. St. Andrew's Memorial, under Marcus's leadership, transformed from a symbol of healthcare discrimination into a beacon of medical equity. Sarah Chen's videos, which she had intended to use as defense, became powerful teaching tools in medical schools across the country. Future healthcare providers watched them and learned to recognize their own biases, to understand how discrimination can hide behind professional dismissiveness. Dr. Warren went on to establish a mentorship program for medical professionals of color, turning her regret into action. The program would eventually expand nationwide, helping to reshape the demographics of American healthcare leadership. And little Zara? She grew up knowing that her birth had sparked a revolution in healthcare equity. Her story was told in medical schools and civil rights classes, a reminder that change often comes from the most painful moments, that justice can arise from injustice, that one family's refusal to be silenced can echo across generations. 5 years later, Amara stood at a podium again, this time accepting a National Civil Rights Award. Looking out at the audience filled with healthcare providers, activists, and families who had benefited from the changes her experience had sparked, she said something that would become the motto of the Richardson Initiative. They thought they could dismiss our pain. Instead, they gave us our power. Back in room 407 at St. Andrew's Memorial, now renamed the Health Equity Suite, a plaque hangs on the wall. It bears a simple message. In this room, a moment of injustice sparked a movement for justice. May every patient who enters here receive the care, respect, and dignity they deserve. Below the plaque is a small bronze statue of a mother holding a newborn, her head held high, her stance unbowed. And beside it, a quote from Marcus Richardson's first day as CEO. Change doesn't come from comfortable places. It comes from moments that force us to confront our failures and choose to be better. Today, we choose to be better. The story of the Richardsons in St. Andrew's Memorial became more than just a viral moment or a hospital scandal. It became a case study in how to transform outrage into action, pain into progress, and a single incident into systemic change. And somewhere in Boston, Sarah Chen's videos still play in hospital training sessions. A stark reminder that the most dangerous form of discrimination often comes not from overt hatred, but from the quiet dismissal of someone's humanity, and that the power to change the system sometimes comes from those the system tried to silence.